Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson. I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best. Here on Telesur. The crime of pederasty has finally broken through the news taboos, through the sheer force of the number of accusations that have come forth. Mexico has been revealed to be one of the nations with the most widespread abuse and the most elaborate cover-ups within the church hierarchy. Now, brave citizens are coming forth, bringing the problem to light and demanding that the culprits be brought to justice. To talk about this issue, we're very fortunate to have with us today in the studio Cristina Sada. Cristina Sada is a businesswoman and an activist from the northern city of Monterrey who's organized the first ever National Forum on Children's Rights and Clerical Pederasty. Cristina, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
We're also pleased to have with us, again, Bernardo Barranco. Bernardo is an expert in religious issues and a writer. Thank you, Bernardo.
¿Qué tal? Hola.
Cristina, I wanted to start with you. This is a unique forum that you've organized because it brings together priests and bishops, survivors, theologians, and human rights experts all in the same room. Usually we hear from one side or the other. What do you hope to achieve with this gathering?
Well, in the first place, open up the debate. The debate has been very closed in Mexico. People feel extremely uncomfortable, do not want to face it, do not want to acknowledge, in spite of the fact that in Mexico, a person was born here called Marcial Maciel, and he's probably the most famous pediator inside the church in the history of the Catholic Church. And
tremendously powerful.
Yeah, and he became an extremely powerful priest. He founded Legionaries of Christ. He became extremely rich, extremely powerful, extremely close to Pope John Juan Pablo II. And so, in spite of the fact that we had number one predator, who was also a drug addict, who had also inflicted damage on his own children, in Mexico, this was the taboo subject. And so in my case, knowing victims, knowing their hurt, knowing their sorrow, how much they suffer, I decided to join them. And I decided to join, in the first place, more than 100 children that had been abused in Oaxaca. After I read in the news that there were some priests that were signing in a priest that was a predator of indigenous children.
Well, tell us about this case. We know that you have made a documentary film.
Yeah, 25 minutes long.
Silvestre, the case of clerical pederasty in the state of Oaxaca. How did you get involved in this case?
Reading the newspaper, and this was not news. It had been going on for 5-7 years when I read about the case, but I immediately got involved with the leader of, there were 9 priests that were saying that Gerardo Silvestre, one of the priests of Oaxaca, was abusing all of those children. And so there was one leader, and I got involved with him, a priest that were denouncing, but their archbishop wasn't. Their archbishop was denying and was defending the predator, because they were very good friends, and I don't know why else. And so the ones that were accused by the archbishop were the priests that were the denouncers, the ones that were that wanted justice for the children. And so I went to Oaxaca, I made the travel, I traveled there, I talked to all the 9 priests, and I didn't know how to react and how I could help. Finally, I decided to do the small documentary, And apparently it had an impact because we put it in Rome and we put subtitles to it in Italian. And in that time, there was not a representative of the Vatican in Mexico. The space was empty. And when he arrived to Mexico, he knew about my documentary because he had been there a few weeks before. And I knew that because of a question a newspaper woman asked him. And so he said, oh, I know one of two cases. Can you imagine all of Mexico? One of two cases of this type of crimes. One of them is in Oaxaca. So I said, oh, he saw my documentary.
Well, so it's had a global impact, and it's had certainly thousands and thousands of views here in Mexico. Well, Bernardo, I wanted to ask you, this is nothing new. There have been accusations that have been coming out, mostly given very little credence by the church itself, and unfortunately not much media attention at the very beginning anyway. So how is it that over the past decades we've finally come to this point where the issue can be dealt with, at least in Mexico?
Hay 20 años de escándalos de abuso sexual en la Iglesia Católica. Son 20 años de escándalos.
There have been sexual abuse scandals in the Catholic Church for 20 years. For the last 20 years, the scandals have been global. We're talking about Boston, we're talking about California, we're talking about Mexico, we're talking about Chile, we're talking about Ireland, about Australia, Germany, Brazil. So, pederasty isn't an isolated phenomenon. It's an institutional, global phenomenon. There's something wrong with a religious institution if they use sexual abuse as a symptom or as an exercise of power. Priests, in the perspective of clericalism, are leaders of conscience for parishioners, for worshippers. They own the morality of the community, but they also aspire, in many cases, to own their bodies. So, it's a big global phenomenon, and it's gotten bigger and led to tragic consequences for the life of the Church. And it's meant that the Church's moral authority has collapsed, and there is a global crisis of credibility that has challenged the last three popes in a very serious way. Now, we can talk about, because it's evident, we live in an era of communication, an era of the media. 50, 60, 100 years ago, we didn't know it was hidden by the institutions, but also the authorities and society, with its culture, allowed these crimes to be hidden. So, I think that the moment we are living in is a moment of greater openness, and Pope Francis doesn't have much choice. He has to take real, serious measures to confront this problem, which is a cancer on church life.
Cristina, one of the things that Bernardo just said has to do with this as being a crime of power. Many times people think of it in a lurid sense as a sex crime between priests and young boys, but when we're talking about someone who has a moral authority in a community abusing, especially in the case of Oaxaca, indigenous boys who can't even speak Spanish, they don't even speak Spanish because they speak their own languages, we're really talking about this tremendous crime of power that's protected by power. When you look at that, the odds are tremendous, to get this changed within society because there's so much resistance as we've seen through history. In a meeting like the forum that you're calling, how can you begin to change that correlation of power to not only out these crimes and bring them to justice, but to begin to prevent them?
Well, I would not say that the forum itself can prevent them. I think what we gave as a possibility in the forum is, in the first place, for the victims to be able to talk freely.
Yeah.
We put the church there to listen to them in a public place. That had never happened with cameras like we have right now. We have a lot of auditorium, not necessarily because there were so many people in the theater, but because we had a lot of news following us, different news porters, you know. So they were exposed. The victims were saying how they had been abused by different priests in front of cameras, in front of a bishop, in front of other priests. So it was really historical. People that attended the forum personally were shaken. They couldn't even move. And they were long hours, 8 hours, then 10 hours the second day. We heard of a victim that from being a child abused became an abuser as an adolescent boy. And he is a very good writer, and he asked us to go forward and read part of his book. So it was one of the most difficult things that I have ever gone through myself. And I'm sure many people that saw it on my Facebook, many people that saw it through the press that was following us. Very, very difficult experience, but tremendous and necessary, because this is a very big problem and nobody has had the guts to put it out that clear, out in the open, in front of cameras.
So you start with a change in consciousness on the part of the church people, on the part of society. Changing
consciousness, and as Bernardo was saying, this is a time of communication. Yeah. I believe this is the time of the truth, the 21st century. I mean, you cannot hide the truth forever. WikiLeaks, whatever, I mean, things are coming out. And authority is crumbling. Authority of the state, authority of the church, authority of whatever, which has been this type of relationships of power over people that do not have power. And now it's changing. So, and we need public opinion. We need people involved. We need more public to support the good causes. And we need to have these opportunities to talk to people like you, so more people can listen to us. So I hope all your American people that speak English and can understand what this is happening, what's going on in Mexico, I hope it really reaches them, and I want them to know that even though we don't have those long lists of apparently victims, we do have them. They're all just hidden, and we're doing our best that they will come out.
So it's vital for viewers to be more aware of what's going on, and there's a very important role for media there.
Of course, very important. We need media. We need media on the victim's side.
Yeah, it's so brave and not at all easy for those people to come out in the first place.
Oh, it's extremely difficult. I mean, challenges are all against you, all against you. I was just with two victims 2 hours ago, and one of them, it took him more than 11 years so that the criminal that abused him as a child for many years was given sentence. There are like 4 sentences in Mexico. That's it. And we are 125 million in a Catholic country where 80% of us are Catholics.
Well, that's another thing that I wanted to ask you about the justice system. We have the case of Marcial Maciel, which first came out in 1997, and when he died in 2008, although there had been some awareness and sanctions on the part of the church, he never spent a day in jail. Are we seeing more responsiveness from the justice system on this? 4 sentences for the number of cases that surely exist is a small amount, to say the least.
Of course. No, justice is very, very far away. I'm telling you, there are only about 4 priests that have been sentenced. That's it. There's no repairing of the damage. Nobody gets any compensation for what the church did to them. In Mexico, there's not one. The people that were abused by Marcial Maciel haven't even gotten a the church has not spoken to ask them to be pardoned at all. There are some people that are 75 years old or more and are still waiting for a pope to say, I am sorry for what Marcial Maciel did to you.
Yeah. And in the United States, there have been economic reparations.
I know,
for many
for
of these
millions
crimes.
of dollars, some of them.
And in Mexico, does that law just not exist, or are they not applying it?
Oh, I was talking to a lawyer today. You're talking about like $300, $500, something ridiculous, and you even have to fight for it for years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Bernardo, we have this movement then going on from below to bring out the survivors' voices, to create forums like this one, and to bring awareness to public opinion. What's the responsiveness been on the part of the Vatican? You mentioned 3 popes who basically covered up the issue for years and years and years. And now we have Pope Francis bringing together a gathering this month to talk about it. Is this a significantly different approach than we've seen before?
Creo que sí, hay una sensibilidad diferente, pero que está obligada por la presión social.
I think so. There is a different sensibility because of all the social pressure, especially, for the first time, the pressure from the media, from big newspapers like the Boston Globe, for example, which was the epicenter, and other big media companies around the world. But now, what's changing is that it's not just the media applying the pressure anymore. It's also the governments who are taking the cases and forcing the church to open up their archives and check. That's happened in the United States, it's happened in Chile, it's happened in Australia. So that's something new. The church, then, is no longer able to take on an attitude of concealment, of complicity, of hoping that time will pass and people will forget, or of trying to blackmail or negotiate with the victims. We're in a moment where the church has to be open. And there's going to be an important meeting, a global summit of presidents of Episcopal conferences, where they're going to talk about pederasty. And they're going to talk about the issue of pederasty with the goal of finding alternatives. Unfortunately, the hierarchy has been very slow, and it's arrived very late. It's nervous about this issue. When Catholics and society expect decisive action, the hierarchy just talks. They ask for forgiveness, they self-criticize, they say they feel very ashamed about everything that happened, but they don't do anything. What we need, and what we asked for from the Pope, from the 3 popes, is that they take action, and they haven't taken action yet. So, the problem is that it's not just a church question anymore. That's why it's very important that lay people, as we've said, that they put pressure on the church about pederasty with a triangular perspective. It's not just about the relationship between the church structure and the victims, but also with the society, with church and lay media. It's about the pressure that we, as lay people, as activists, as victims, can put on the church, because all of the success we've had is because of decisive action by victims who are speaking out, even if many years have passed, as Cristina said. And I think it's a good opportunity for many people. The meeting from February 21st to the 24th was one of the last opportunities for the church to take action on pederasty and make right. And now, it's not just about pederasty. There have been revelations about rape and sexual abuse of nuns, which is an even more complicated issue because we're talking about a connection between sexuality and Catholic tradition. And that's a really difficult issue, but, well, we can talk about that another time.
And again, they're crimes of power with an institution that's male-dominated and has such a strict hierarchy. We've come to the end of the program. We've come to the end of the program. Cristina, I wanted to ask you, what can society do besides listening and that's becoming a bit more widespread thanks to your work, thanks to sympathetic media, and in order to get more justice in these cases?
Well, I think we can pressure that the law changes in Mexico. For example, we can pressure that what the Catholic Church does changes too. We're talking about priests that depend directly from the Pope, but then there are other religious organizations that are Catholic, that they have their own hierarchy, and they also have problems, you know.
Yeah.
So we want to know what are the codes to protect the children, what are their protocols. We want to see the archives. We want to see where the 152, for example, priests that have been suspended, that are Archbishop from Monterrey, and he's the president of the Conferencia Episcopal Mexicana. I'll try to say that in English. Episcopal Conference, Mexican Conference, and he's the president, so he's a leader in all of Mexico. He just made the statement 2 days ago saying there are 152 priests that have been suspended because of pederasty. And me, as an involved person, says, where are they?
Yeah.
What's their names? In what church were they? Are they free? What did you do with them?
Because
but that's
they have
what
a
he
tendency
said.
to
so
shift them
for
around.
me, it's a scandal what he said. It's good that he, for the first time, admits publicly, you know, that there are cases of pederasty and priests doing those crimes during his time, but he's not telling us who they are and what did he and the church do with them.
Well, I wish we had more time to talk about this important issue. Cristina, Sada, Bernardo Barranco, thank you so much for being with us.
It's our pleasure.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.